waiting to use this. My mom brought me this from, I think, Scotland. I don't know what it is.
Ooh.
It's a sherry cask. So,
What is it, liquor?
yeah, it's a Sunday night.
Whiskey?
Yeah.
All right, there you go.
Well, you got your
Damn,
kombucha?
I don't really have anything good at my house.
Yeah, you got to get
I
something.
got my
It's the first
kombucha green
podcast.
tea.
It's the first. I can't even open this damn thing. But yeah, go ahead, start it off if you want.
All right, cool. So welcome, everyone. So for our first podcast, we're just going to go over principles for dealing with the changing world order, why nations succeed and fail by Ray Dalio. So this we're going to go over in 3 different podcasts. We're planning to just go over the 3 parts of the book, part 1, part 2, and part 3. So today we'll do part 1, and we'll get into it once Jeff pours himself a drink.
Things are not going good on my end.
It's all good.
Cool. Well, yeah. Kick it off.
So
you want to
just like very high level, I think, about the book is Ray Dalio's the founder of Bridgewater Associates, large private equity hedge fund. And based upon reading the introduction and different parts of the book, he's essentially writing books now to just instill all the knowledge that he's gained over all these years in trying to develop investment strategies. So he's a big studier of history, developing theories based upon his knowledge, history, capital markets, debt cycles, and he's just constantly learning and constantly time testing his thought processes, and that's what this book kind of culminates into. So I don't know his exact age, but I believe he's like in his 70s.
yeah, he's
So
older.
He's been on Wall Street, a long time. So I think he has a lot of great knowledge, and don't quote me on it, but I think he's one of the largest hedge funds in the world.
The most interesting perspective that he had, I think, was that he had mentioned his inspiration for even beginning this, not even the book, but just this, like the subject matter of even getting into this whole like financial landscape that we're going to talk about, was just because events that had happened in his life that really surprised him, he found to be the most pivotal. And what he felt was the best way forward was to actually look backward and try to understand if things weren't happening if things that had happened that surprised him, if they hadn't happened in his lifetime yet, had they happened in the past? And if they did, how did they play out? And he started to find that a lot of these rise and falls of certain civilizations had happened over and over again in similar fashion, going back hundreds of years and thousands of years even into history. And so it was just through that inspiration that he's trying to make sense of what the future is going to be. So it's like, in a weird roundabout way, it's like looking at the past to determine the future, if it's possible to determine the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's very smart. And I remember at one point he said that many investors don't look at society from that viewpoint. They don't study history and try to determine where we are on a larger economic situation or larger economic scale. Like, what direction are we headed in? So I think when you're a little blinded by like your bias of your life now isn't necessarily how life is going to be in the future. And many great civilizations which collapsed didn't anticipate their collapse, essentially. So I think he's very aware of that. And since, he owns one of the largest hedge funds, is the president of one of the largest hedge funds in the world, he has an obligation to preserve people's wealth and people's money. And in order to do so, you have to look at things, I think, at a macro level. And that's something that I just like always loved. I always loved looking at the world at a macro level, whether it be like just different people's cultures or, you know, how things kind of make sense. Like I never liked just being like pigeonholed in like just one thought process, like go to work, be an accountant, do your audit and come home. It's like, yeah, but like, what about the economy? What about the real estate market? How does it affect my job? How does it like, I love thinking like that. So that's why I think this book is also like very interesting, because he really goes back the last 500 years and studies like the rise of China and the fall of China, the great empire of, you know, the Netherlands, when they rose to become the world's reserve currency and then collapsed. And then he talks about the UK and their rise and collapse, and then also America's rise. And where we currently are today is sort of, in his projection essentially, is we're sort of on the decline, and China is also on the subsequent incline. So I just think that's just very interesting. I think people feel that. I mean, I work in central Connecticut in a town that used to be a huge manufacturing hub, back in from you know, the 30s into the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s. And then as China's economies opened up, a lot of the jobs here have left. So you don't have that level of manufacturing that you used to have. And so it's quite obvious how wealth gaps are rising, inequalities are growing, and it's quite obvious to me. So like when he hits on some of those points, I just think it's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
So
yeah, I
let's
mean,
take it back. So
I don't know if you want to talk about each chapter.
yeah, we can talk. So um, I think the best way to preface this for anyone that's listening is to just go back and set the stage for how countries hit their rise and falls, right? So basically, the way Ray Dalio puts it in his book is that every major empire, and the the term that he uses is the world reserve power, right? It's the world reserve currency that's ultimately what makes a leading empire. So right now, the U.S. is the world's reserve currency. That was set up in 1945. Before us was the British. Before them was the Dutch. And does he go back before that, or was it the Chinese again? Those,
Yeah,
do you know?
I think originally it was the Chinese, because in ways like he talks about how like before the European powers really hit the Industrial Revolution, and reached their true like colonization power, like time frame. So probably starting around in the 1600s when the Netherlands was on its rise. Before that, like China was had great innovations. They were like leading the world in goods, like quality manufacturing. So like Europeans, I remember he mentioned several times, like Europeans wanted Chinese goods because they were of such high quality, but the Chinese didn't really want any of the European goods because they were kind of crappy. So I think that was like when, you know, early explorers tried to break into China back in like the 1400s and
Hmm.
1500s. So yeah, I mean, I think China was the superpower, and for many years before that, they had many dynasties that were quite powerful, and kind of put Europe to shame, because Europe was largely just filled with wars and small little warring nations, and was very geographically isolated. So you had a lot of different tribes, and there wasn't a ton of unification, you know, before,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the 1600s between countries. It was a lot of like feudal systems. So China was like, you know, you go back before 500 years, I mean, China was the superpower of the world in many ways. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
innovations, and then it kind of shifted to Europe. So yeah.
Yeah. And so what's really interesting is what he studied is that all of these empires, as they rose and fall, went through the same phases, and they had sort of the same internal and external conflicts and pressures that the U.S. is experiencing today. So it's almost like it's a systematic consistency that happens through every empire, and almost every empire has kind of in the process of rising. It almost the what's the best way to word this? Like the way that it builds itself to be successful and to be the world reserve currency, that same system is actually what contributes and ultimately leads to its decline, to its fall. So this was seen through all of them, all every major world currency in the
Yeah,
past. Go ahead.
yeah, they all sort of shared a similar cycle. So that's where he kind of comes up with like these different like determinants. So I mean, he talks about how when a new world order starts, essentially you start off with a strong leader, then you go into a stage of inventiveness. So you have like new technologies, new inventions. Then there's like heavy investment in education. A strong culture starts to build. You have good resource allocation. Then you lead to good competitiveness, strong income growth, strong markets and financial centers, which in the US, like you see all of that is like quite obvious from 1945 to 20 years ago. I mean, that's what we've had. We had strong leaders with like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and JFK, and these figures that are known throughout the world. They invested in education. They put people to work. We had low levels of debt. We invested in education. We had a strong like national culture of independence and America kind of as like the good guys. Good competitiveness, strong income growth. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Like we had such a great middle class for many years. For several decades after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
That was what made America so special. And I think like to be desired, like so many people from around the world want to come to America because we had a strong middle class. Like, hey, if you worked hard, like you can own a house, you can have some financial independence, and then strong markets and financial centers. I mean, New York, that became the financial capital of the world. And, we both lived there, me a little longer than you. So, but yeah, like it's quite obvious. Like you don't realize it like when you're living in New York or you're in that area, but it really is the financial mecca of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that's kind of interesting. And
Well,
then
you
you
can see it
head
in the
into
international
sort of,
presence too.
yeah,
Like how many
yeah.
foreign businesses
I
have
mean, the UN,
exactly UN. How many foreign businesses have offices there, or they come and they do business dealings there, and
yep,
that's ultimately what makes it the world reserve currency. Is that businesses all around, or not businesses, but countries all around the world accept the U.S. They do business with
dollar.
U.S. dollars. They accept the U.S. dollars, and then many of them even save in U.S. dollars.
Yep.
So yeah, sorry I
Yeah.
interrupted you, but
No, absolutely. And then he kind of talks about like, no, it's all good. Gotta go back and forth. But then he sort of talks about you're on the rise. So when you have strong leadership and you have all those qualities I mentioned before, you then turn into a stage where you become like less productive. You become overextended. You start losing your competitiveness, and wealth gaps start to rise. So I think that's indicative of where we are right now, based upon what Ray Dalio is saying. Like we are becoming less productive. I feel like in many ways. I mean, technology I think is a good. Technology kind of masks it in a lot of ways because our technology is just constantly rising, right? Like we're just developing AI, and the United States is leading on medical innovations and whatnot. But so in some ways we are becoming more productive, but I think we're becoming more productive at the highest levels, whereas the middle level of America is becoming less productive in many ways. I feel like
mm-hmm.
more people are on more people are disabled, more people have mental issues, more people, are just struggling. And then as a country, we become overextended. We got involved in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's just crazy. I mean, we have to finance those wars, and we finance them on the by printing money and selling U.S. debt to other nations to finance these wars, and we're indebting our future generations, and that's slowly making us less competitive. I feel like I don't have the perception that people look at America the same way they used to maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And then just wealth gaps are rising. I mean, to me, it's so obvious to see. You go through like small town after small town across America, and you just see these wealth gaps. You see, these old cities, Detroit, or these small towns in Ohio, and they're just kind of ravaged. I mean, they used to be like productive towns, and now people are suffering with opioid addictions. They can't get good jobs. They're working minimum wage, whereas their parents maybe had like good pensions. They're part of a union, and you see that drastic difference. And you live down in Naples. I mean, Naples is the epitome of the top like wealth bracket, and how money is just filtering to the rich. I mean, you've seen it since you've been down there, right? I mean, since what, 2005?
Absolutely. Well, Florida in general is a mecca for, it's a retiree community. So you get a lot of people who come here and they have either second homes, or they've built a nice business and they sold it, and they come down and they build something nice for themselves to retire into. The other thing is too, Miami is a massive hub for international, both business and for vacations. So there's a lot of foreign money, businessmen from China, businessmen from the Middle East, and businesswomen. So, just families coming from all over the world.
Yeah. So you see that and I think that also ties into other stuff that the book talks about, is how like people try to preserve their money. When certain parts of the country take on excessive debts, they need to tax their people more, right? Even though like states don't have the ability to print money, the federal government does. So that can be a way to raise money for the government. And that's a lot of what he talks about but states can't do that. So if states take on a lot of obligations, they give out pensions, these wonderful pensions to cops where they're making 80% of their salary for the rest of their life. Meanwhile, they're only like 40 years old. That comes with a cost, and states can't print dollars, but what they can do is they can tax the people who live there. And I mean, I've noticed that in New York, it's just like left and right. I mean, it's one of the reasons I did leave, although I didn't necessarily go to a much cheaper state. Connecticut, I think, is definitely a little bit better. But what do these states have to do when you take on debt? You have to raise taxes. And I think that's why a lot of people who have money at this point are just saying, fuck it, I'm going down to Florida. I want to save some money. Things are more open. Things are a little more free. And I think that's the problem. So I think like the state of New York, although it seems to be in good fiscal like health right now, apparently, my prediction is that that's going to change, because I don't know how it sustains itself with so many wealthy people leaving. But again, I think that's like, again, where you're going to have like wealth gaps are rising. Productivity is going to decrease, I think, in the state of New York. I mean, you see that like North Carolina is becoming a big, financial hub for banks. A couple major banks are headquartered down there. There's less taxes, a little less of a regulatory environment,
Let's talk about that for a second, because productivity is something that I think a lot of people don't understand. And it's a very important factor when it comes to inflation. I think a lot of people, especially young, millennials, our generation, I think they have a bit of a misconception about inflation. They hear inflation and they think the federal government is theoretically in charge of it. They hear inflation, they think about home prices rising and being, 30 years old and not able to afford a home. They think about Chipotle going up to, $14 for a burrito bowl when in college it was $8. That's that's what they think about when it comes to inflation. But inflation really is a measure of a country's productivity, right? So let's like break that down a little bit. Let's talk about what inflation is, because there's a number of
Yeah.
factors. It's the money supply, it's supply and demand. And in Ray Dalio's book, he talks about the difference between the real market and the financial market, which I think is a pretty good segue to just break that down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, no, you want to keep going on that?
yeah, we can. So essentially, like inflation is when you have the market, you have supply and demand, right? So if you boil it down to the most basic idea, your money is supposed to be representative of gold, which is supposed to have a finite supply. And what makes gold valuable is the fact that it's a finite supply, right? So a lot of people want it, and there's only so much of it. I think it was in. Do you know what year we left the gold standard? I don't remember if that was was it the 60s?
I think we briefly went off during like the Depression era.
And then we went
And
back on,
then I
though.
think it was under Nixon in like the early 70s, I want to say,
Okay.
where we officially left the gold standard.
And so since then, what that basically did was it gave the government or not the government, but the Federal Reserve and the government, because it's basically related in a weird way. It gave them the ability to print more money into the money supply, and that affects your debts. So the government, there's a certain amount of money out in the world, and there's constantly transactions being made with it. There's people saving it. And when there's transactions, you stimulate the economy and you stimulate the money supply. When you save, you do the opposite because you're pulling money out of the money supply. It comes to a certain point. This is like very, very complicated, but it gets to a point where the government is also has expenses. And if, it manages its money in a certain way. And it gets to a point where it can't service its debt anymore. And so what then happens a lot of times is the ideal thing to do would be to raise taxes, because you're increasing the income into the government's income and has more money. But that's an unpopular opinion among the people. So politicians don't generally do that. People don't want to be taxed more. And so how do you pay its debt? Well, you print more money. What does that do? It adds more money to the money supply and therefore devalues the purchasing power of the dollar, because of, again, supply and demand. There's a demand for certain things. Think about limited edition anything, limited edition cars, limited edition posters. There's a ton of people that want it, and it's a limited edition, so there's a limited supply. Therefore, those usually go for more money, and that money is that amount that it will sell for is determined by the market, how much somebody's willing to pay for it. The minute you add more of those, it becomes easier to get, more common to see them, and so people aren't willing to spend as much money on those. That's the same thing that happens with inflation and the money supply in a very basic, watered down way. The other thing, though, during oh great, I forgot what I. Let me recatch my thought, because I forgot I forgot what I was going to say there. So if you got anything to add on inflation, feel free to go for it.
It's all good, dude. Yeah, no, I think you're hitting some good points there. I mean, what politicians have to do, right? Like as great empires or economies are on the rise, is they give more and more benefits to their people. People originally, they start working very hard, but eventually, productivity slows down. You sort of reach your top of your debt cycle. And what can politicians do? They can cut people's benefits. In America today, they can cut Social Security, which is very unpopular. They can cut, Medicare, Medicaid benefits. or you can raise taxes. That doesn't also win many votes either, because nobody wants their taxes increased. But what can you do very subtly, which not many people pick up on? The average person doesn't pick up on it or knows who to point their finger on or finger to when they do this, and that's print money. So printing money is an easy, sly thing to be able to do in order to, one, provide your benefits and service your debt. So
Mm-hmm.
as you keep taking on without increasing taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where America's at. I mean, America's just not so quietly recently, but before that, when we were, in our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've just been printing dollars. Other countries who are productive, let's say countries like China, are buying our debt, and we're slowly going to eventually lose our reserve currency if we keep doing that, because eventually our dollars are going to be worth less and less. And at some point, institutions, governments are not going to want to buy US debt anymore. And when that happens, taxes have got to rise. People who are wealthy, that was a lot of what he talked about. They want to then leave their currency. And what happens with that is, like, restrictions get put into place, capital requirement restrictions. Governments don't let their people leave their country. They don't let them buy gold. I mean, that I know has been a thing in the past in America. Like, they used to not let you, like, buy gold.
Mm-hmm.
When there was different financial crises and the Great Depression. So that can happen, and we haven't really experienced that in our lifetimes, and most people's lifetimes here that are alive today have not really experienced that. But that is a potential, if eventually the dollar starts losing its reserve status.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say China's investing in these other countries and throughout Africa, providing, funding for roads. Eventually, the Chinese currency can overshadow the U.S. currency, and they're slowly doing that,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of ties into, where you were getting at before a little bit.
Yeah, I remembered my thought. What I meant to touch on was the aspect of productivity in that whole thing. So there's obviously the money
Yeah.
supply, like the tightening and loosening of the money supply that affects prices and inflation. But there's also the aspect of productivity, which you made a great example of, talking about New York, and how if you look at New York as its own country as opposed to just a state. Think about all the states as just their own country. All of those businesses that have moved from New York to North Carolina, well, they're now paying taxes in North Carolina, and so the state of New York loses out on that income. In a strange kind of roundabout way, the same thing happens, and you've seen it in Connecticut, where we've moved all these factory jobs over to China. I mean, how many times you pull out a table from Amazon's, made in China, or a coffee mug made in China, right? So all of our goods, a lot of our tangible goods are made overseas. The only thing that's really, like, curated in the US anymore is software, for the most part, and military technologies, like things at Raytheon and certain aircrafts and stuff like that. But a lot of our, like, just everyday goods have been outsourced. Well, we lose that productivity, that level of output, to China, and they benefit from that. And that's the exact same thing that happened in the Dutch Empire. And there was an article, as I was reading this book and getting familiar with Ray Dalio, he made a great example of the British and the Dutch when it came to building ships. And so the Dutch were extremely skilled
Yep.
at building ships. And so that was a big thing. They supplied a lot of country with different, like, ships and vessels and whatever. And so as the demand grew and they could charge more money for it, the labor for those Dutch workers increased along with it. And it eventually got to a point where you have, your profit margin is kind of at stake. Well, what did the Dutch do? It found that they could have the designs be done by Dutch shipbuilders and get all the specifications and everything that they wanted through the Dutch, but then actually have the British build them for at a cheaper rate, and it would increase their profit margins. It sounds exactly like what we did with China, where we design a lot of materials and a lot of things, and then
Yeah.
we have cheaper labor in China build those items. What that actually did, though, is inadvertently it contributed to the productivity of the British Empire. And so they rose to prominence just in the same way that China is rising to prominence now. So
Yeah,
you have to think
absolutely.
about,
I'm also just thinking, if you see the Yeti, it's a little hard to tell on
is
the
it made in
screen
China?
here. No, yes, it is, but
Yeah,
it says
designed in
designed
the
in
USA.
Texas, made in China. So
Yeah, exactly. So it's the same thing. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. I don't think, you know, and they get upset. Like if we bring if we bring, I don't know, if we bring iPhones and cameras and like all sorts of stuff back to the US, yes, it's going to cost us more. And then that kind of contributes to inflation a little bit because you're paying more out of pocket, but at the same time, you're also contributing more towards the GDP of the country. Um, and so on a global scale, I don't want to say it balances out, it almost recharges us
yeah,
by doing
yeah.
that.
No, I mean, I totally. I think that's a great example that he does point out in the book about
Mm-hmm.
how like the Dutch really were one of the first civilizations that he sort of talks about in the book, and how they were like amazing shipbuilders, and by being great shipbuilders they were able to take advantage of colonization and being able to colonize different parts of the world. And then be, and then along with that, they were developing this like merchant class, an artisan class. And what did they decide to do? They opened up like the stock exchange, and created the Dutch East India Company. And with that, people were able to work, save their money, and then put their money into exploration and then get a return on their money. So it really was like ingenious kind of idea back then. And then, like you said, it just transferred down to England. England were building a lot of the ships because they had cheaper labor, they were less developed, and eventually they got smart, and they learned how to build the ships. And the Dutch became, more and more comfortable, as they were kind of on their rise, and they overextended themselves, took on too much debt, and weren't cautious of, England's rise. And eventually England just, knocked them out of the picture. So I think studying history in those examples is great.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was definitely a good example there to bring up for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's just important for people to realize that, for people that like, these are the things that unfortunately our schools and education system isn't great at teaching. Some of them do,
No.
not all of them, but most. I shouldn't say that none of them do, but because some definitely do, and there's definitely some great professors out there that are on top of this, but most don't, and so most people don't know these things, and they have um, a very, very broken view of inflation and how the money supply works and how it affects, everybody's very short-sighted, and they think about their own lives. They think about the taxes that they have to pay and the mortgage that they have and the salary that they're bringing in and how their whole little financial world works. But the reality of it is you can change your financial world by understanding it on a broader scale and then knowing what you're actually voting for when it comes time, to
Yeah.
have your voice be heard, so to speak. So it's important to have an understanding, and it's important to have a good view of how world economics work and how business partnerships work, and be able to
Yeah. No, I
manage your
totally agree.
finances.
Totally agree. I think it's like so important, and I think a lot of history is taught in class and school in a way that, you know, you learn events, right? You learn, hey, in so and so year this act was passed and that led to this. And like I'm thinking, I don't know, the Revolutionary War, and you had the Stamp Act, and you had all these different acts, and things just kind of seem like chronological, and just kind of like, you know what the end is gonna, what's gonna happen. But in the moment, and that's why I love like reading history, is that when you read history, you get an idea, especially when people write letters. Like I read like John Adams' book, and it's fascinating because between him and his wife, they wrote a lot, they corresponded all the time, and they kept all their letters. So you get an idea of like what their mindset was during that time. And their mindset, they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know if they were going to end up being, you know, tried for treason and killed, and they didn't know the outcome of what was going to happen, that he was going to become president, like all these different things. So I think that's also just like something we're taught in school, like, hey, X happens, then Y happens, and then Z happens, and then here's your multiple choice test, and, you know, pick, bubble in the right answer, you know. And it doesn't really look at things like holistically. It doesn't look at like, what does that mean for today's world? What does that mean for me living now? You kind of have to draw those conclusions by yourself. You know, they teach the sequence of events, but they don't really put it together and say, hey, what does this mean? Right. You know, they might do a little bit of that, but not the way that I think it should be done, because it's so important, I think, today to study history and see that we don't know what's going to happen, right? History gives us a little inclination as to what can happen, and to be aware of that. I don't think people are aware of that. And I mean, just to go on a little bit of a tangent, I know we tend to always bring up the stuff with like the Second Amendment, and we're big like 2A, you know, Second Amendment supporters. Is like, people don't think that like revolution can happen. People don't think that, you know, there's a lot of narrative out there in legacy media that's like, you don't need a gun. Why do you need a gun? We live in a civilized society. You know, there's no revolution. There's nothing to be afraid about. Like, why do you need a gun? And they don't understand history. They don't understand, you know, what China went through with revolutions, how many people died, what Russia did to the Ukrainians back in the 30s with starvation and famine, and killing their own people. And if you ever read Alexander, I'm going to butcher his name, Shalonitsky's book, The Gulag Archipelago. I'll have to find out how to pronounce his name. But like, family turned on family, friends turned on other family, on other friends, saying, hey, they're enemies of the state, or whatnot. And it's so important to be aware of what occurred and what can occur. And we're no different just because, hey, we have a democracy. We look at, and that was another thing, like, he gets on later into the book, talking about like China and America. I won't get into too much of that, but Americans tend to very much look at things as, hey, our history started 300 years ago, you know, and the Chinese, and look at things, hey, history started several thousand years ago, and there's been rises and collapses in our society, whereas we've just had like an expansionist society, right? Like we Americans, or, you know, people who left Europe, colonized the colonies, then slowly expanded, and we've just had like this repetitive rise. You know, we've expanded across the country. We've taken over then Alaska and Hawaii, and we've just continued to expand. The Spanish-American Wars, and then after World War II, we've exploded even more as a global power. And we just think that, like, hey, we're probably on this trajectory. We're a great country. We're America, right? Like, but so many things can happen, and it's so important to study history and connect the dots. And I think Ray Dalio does it great, talking about how at the end of the day, everything, the world essentially just works around money, right? Like, it's a sad reality at times, because sometimes we don't like to always think that way. but that's, at the end of the day, that's what it is. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we wake up to go to our jobs to make a salary, to afford the things we want, and to, you know, have a house and pay for food and have shelter and have some enjoyment and travel and whatever. You know, that money runs everything. So
Mm-hmm.
it's so important to see, to learn how money works and to understand these debt cycles. I think that's like extremely fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
The rise and fall of nations, and to study it, especially important for Americans to understand and study, because we're the global superpower and we could potentially be on our decline. And he kind of gets into that, like the decline stages, where he talks about like large debts. I mean, what's our deficit now? Like over $30 trillion. I mean, it's like
Mm-hmm.
an unfathomable amount of money. We just print money, you know, continuously print money. I mean, we printed what, over $3 trillion during like 2 years of COVID, which is just absolutely ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
That's like a whole, that's a whole other thing. We could talk about PPP loans and all of that. And I, in my opinion, how we just went like way over the top. Then you just have internal conflict, right? Like we see it, like, I mean, even within my own family, it's like, it's crazy. Like you're in the Republican camp, they're in the Democratic camp, and we can't even have conversations because we're so emotionally charged with how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
And social media has just been like horrible, horrible, I feel like. So our internal conflicts rising. Eventually, we could lose our reserve currency status. People don't want to buy our debt anymore. Hey, we have 30 trillion, 40 trillion. I remember hearing a story too recently, on NPR, that talked about how within like 10 years, I think 1/5 of the tax revenue that America brings in is going to just service our interest payments on our debt. So that's one in $5 that the federal government collects is just going to pay for the interest within the next 10 years,
Jesus.
which is frightening. Then you have weak leadership. I mean,
Say no more.
look at who's in the presidency right now. I mean, you know, like come on. I mean, yeah, maybe in some ways our current president is able to sometimes, at times, reach across the aisle and make some compromise, but do we really need a guy in charge? I mean, it's so reflective of like our society degrading that we have a president that can't communicate well at this
Mm-hmm.
stage, who's in an elderly he's an elderly man, but and he's not, he can't give interviews well, he can't talk off the cuff. I feel that he's put a lot of people around him, surrounded by a lot of people that just tell him what to do.
Mm-hmm.
He says certain things and then totally backtracks on them the next day, and he's just not consistent. So I think that's also like weak leadership, and even weak leadership before that with Trump. I think, in my personal opinion, like Trump, you know, he kind of riled the nationalistic, like, you know, fervor, and kind of was very anti-China, but you know, he sowed a lot of division in people. He wasn't bringing people together from across the aisles.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually you could lead to a civil war and revolution. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I've heard that type of talk on social media. I've heard it on news organizations. I mean, there's been talks of that, and it's like, never in my life. I mean, yeah, I was a kid not that long ago, but I don't remember that type of animosity and even a thought of like a revolution or some kind of separation of the country. Like those weren't even thoughts really, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think we're headed in a bad trajectory. So I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Well, everybody. So going back to one of the points that you made, was like the education system and being taught like history and to memorize and stuff. And the thing is, the education system has basically made it's basically made memorization the symbol of success and of intelligence. If you can memorize things, then you're going to get straight A's and you're going to get into a good college, and that means you're going to get, you're going to be successful. It does not. I say that a little loosely because I feel like in some places it is still important, and I think there's still an emphasis on it, but it doesn't put as much emphasis on critical thinking as it does memorization. And that's what we need. We need people to be able to think critically about things. You need to understand things as a
Yeah.
system, not just memorize talking points, memorize dates, memorize like you need to really like take some information in, process it, and ask yourself if it makes sense. And you need to do that with everything. You need to do that with financial
Yep.
our financial situation. You need to do that with our political situation. You need to do that with, you know, pretty much everything in life. And I don't think there's as much emphasis on that anymore as there used to be. Why? I don't know. I don't know if it's a byproduct of mass production. Like if you think back to 70s and 80s, even the 90s to some degree, like high school was a big deal if you graduated. That was like, you know,
Yeah.
that was a pretty big deal. That was enough to get you a job at most places. If you went to college, that was even better. And then anything above that master's degrees was reserved for very, very specific applications and positions. Now it's like go to school, do a 5-year program, graduate with a bachelor's and a master's degree. So you have somebody who's coming out at 22, 23 years old with a master's degree, zero work experience, and going into the same position that was really, I mean, to be blunt about it, it's the same position that people did with a high school degree 25, 30 years
Oh yeah.
ago. So
Absolutely.
I don't,
Absolutely. I mean, you see that too. Like, yeah.
yeah, I just don't know if that
Sorry.
is where the no, you're fine. I don't know if that's where the memorization came into play. Like because how do you push out a student, how do you push out those numbers all the time with and teach people to think critically? It's not easy. So
I think it's hard because as things get bigger too, as you start having larger standards, right, you have to be able to assess people, assess kids. I mean, I'm not in education, but I can just imagine like, you know, and try to just look at it from a very high level. Like if you set standards like, hey, I want everybody to, you know, be able to understand these materials about, let's say, a history course, and then you give like an examination, a state regents or whatever, like you have to have people, you have to have the kids memorize. It's very hard to teach concepts because it's not as tangible. You know, I'm thinking like my dad. My dad is, you know, a doctor. You obviously know that. And he doesn't practice anymore, but he studied in Italy, and it was a different concept. So in America, you take examinations, right? You get a packet, you know, that's your test. You got to write in some responses, you got to answer multiple choice, whatever. In Italy, it's totally different. Like all it is oral examinations. So you get up in front of the whole class, and the professor asks you, you know, what do you do if a patient comes in and has like these symptoms, and go like, what would your response be? How would you deal with that patient? You know, that's just like
critical
a
thinking.
small example, but essentially it's all oral. Yeah, it's all oral exams, and you can't bullshit your way through that. Like
Mm-hmm.
you have to think. You know, you have to be able to apply what you've learned and what you've read to a practical situation. You know, and that to me was like such an interesting way of teaching people, and it's the way like medicine's been taught for many years in Europe, right? They've had like, you know, that's how they've done things. There was a lot of oral traditions, a lot of like, and that's, I think, an amazing way to learn. And that's the only time I've ever heard where there's been like oral examinations. I've never really heard of that in my whole, you know,
Pilots.
education. And I think like you're saying, I think, yeah, pilots
Yeah,
have to,
pilots have to have. They go through multiple
but
multiple oral exams.
but few and far between. Not many professions that I know do that.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely something interesting about that, because I
Mm-hmm.
think when you can verbally convey what you've learned, I think that's where it becomes very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the education system is providing that to people. I mean, to me, it's pathetic. I mean, I think actually Connecticut just passed a law where they're going to include financial education in, like, before you, in order to graduate high school, you have to pass like a financial whatever literacy class. So I think that's like a start. It's really good.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's like very, very important, and people need to learn some of these like basic concepts. People need to learn, like, honestly, before COVID, I didn't understand what inflation was. I mean, I went to college. Nobody talked about our debt and printing of money. And yeah, I learned about kind of quantitative easing and sort of what happened with the financial crisis and how these banks were taking loans, essentially pooling them together as securities and then selling them off. And rating agencies were giving these loans great ratings, but the reality is you know, they were secured by people's homes that like people could not afford, and that just led to an extreme bubble because there was not enough regulation around it. And but so like I learned those concepts, but I didn't really learn like what the country did after that. Like essentially all we did was just print more money,
Mm-hmm.
to give to the banks that needed liquidity. And I think federal regulators, the government, politicians, they just got smart and they're just like, hey, we can just keep printing. It
Mm-hmm.
didn't really, it kind of helped the economy. It seemed like it was a win-win. Inflation didn't take off like crazy. Let's just print, and I think we're headed for some trouble in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a little bit of a tangent from what you were getting at, but I think just trying to like pull things full circle into,
Yeah. No,
into the book
it's
as
all
well.
relevant. It's all relevant. And that's what I mean. Anybody who's listening to this, they have to really just ask themselves, like, why is this stuff important? Why do I care? Why do I care about
Yeah.
changing world order? Why do I care about, um, the United States and its world
Debt
reserve currency?
cycles.
Yeah, you care because this has all happened before, where major empires have gone through the same phases that we've already experienced, some that we're in the middle of now. But essentially, all of these things with inflation, with servicing debt, it's happened before. This is what's caused countries to lose that status and to have their debts restructured and the wealth redistributed. You've had these countries that have come up from basically nothing, have super prosperous periods, create loads of wealth, um, and what do? They take out debt, they borrow money to double down on it. That's another thing that he mentioned too, which I don't know if we talked about yet, but um, borrowing money is effectively what causes all the bubbles that we've seen. Whether it was the dot-com bubble, the real estate bubble in 2008.
Yep.
People, things go well, they want to double down on what they're doing, so they borrow more money, put more money towards it. You ultimately out leverage yourself. The bubble pops. And yeah, so all of these things have taken place over time. And if you want to be aware of what to do with your money, if you're young, you're graduating, hopefully you don't have too many student loans, or you do, you're paying them off. Whatever your situation is, it's good to be aware of what's happening on the global scale, because ultimately it's going to affect you at some point too. Um,
Yeah.
so it's just understanding patterns and understanding where we're at. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
so
I mean, people take out huge loans to go to school to learn, right? In order to make like a good living. But if you don't think smart, you're setting yourself up for failure in many ways. So if you could just understand these patterns, right? Like, I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody who goes to like medical school takes out loans. They go to school. They're used to taking out debt. They never learn about finances, and they figure, hey, I'm making good money now, right? So, and I'm used to taking out debt, so I'll buy the big car, I'll buy the big house. And you don't understand money. You need to work smart. You need to realize, like, hey, buying a house and taking a huge mortgage, that's not really an asset to you. Buying a nice car, yeah, it might be nice when you drive it off the lot and show your friends and show up to work with. They might be able to work hard, but they might not work smart, and if they can learn different concepts and work smart, it just goes so much further.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like both of our mindsets is like, hey, let's work smart in what we do. Let's try to learn and see around the curve, and not just keep our head down or just focus like this with blinders,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of people do, and I think that's so important. So that's one thing that I think reading this book is helped with. I mean, it's really opened my eyes to the debt cycle and kind of put more of a theory behind what I'm seeing decline around me. Do you know
Yes.
what I mean?
Yes.
I think that helps. Like you're very susceptible when you're not educated or you don't understand the printing of money, and you see inflation rising, or you see like politicians saying, "Hey, this is China's fault," or whatever. But then the reality is, it's like China didn't force us to print more U.S. dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Our politicians have, and our who we are as citizens has. We become used to a certain standard of living where corporations are taking advantage of citizens by making credit cards easily available, by making debt cheap. All these things are creating a bad mindset for people. And I think it's just so important to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. And over leveraging, like, so we're in a great position right now to even talk about this because we just had the US raise their debt ceiling, right? So we're seeing all of this come to fruition. So everything that he talked about with debt cycles with the government, basically there's an imbalance, right? So the government
Yeah.
spends more than it earns. And then there comes a point where it has to pay its debt and it can't. And so what does it do? Well, you can either again raise taxes, which it seldom does, or you print more money and add money into the money supply and use the new printed money to pay the debts that you owe. And that's happened time and time again. That's what happened a
Yep.
few weeks ago when they raised the debt ceiling. Okay, fine, we'll just raise it up, and they just kick the ball down further, further down the road, deal with it at a later time. But like, what are they doing to correct course? Like, are we are they raising taxes? Are they cutting expenses? Are we bringing jobs back here to raise productivity? What are we doing to combat that? Because
Yep.
otherwise, we're just going to end up back in the same place in a few months or a few years. I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm not super up to date on how much we're spending per day, but the point is, um, these are the things that like us as U.S. citizens and people
It
who are
matter.
effectively, these people work for us. Let's not forget that. That's what they should be doing. So we need to arm ourselves with the knowledge and ask the difficult questions and say, what are you doing to correct this? Because there's really not that. It's really when
Yeah.
you. It is a complicated concept, but it's really not that difficult when you understand the fundamentals. Like, there's very specific things that the government should be doing if it wants to correct course. It's up to us to ask those questions. What are you doing? Um, and
Yeah.
I also like another topic you brought up, not to go too far on a tangent, but I think over leveraging ourselves has been um, an issue. Ray Dalio talks about the real estate market, right? We saw during COVID with the mass migration, people leaving different states, and um, real estate market going crazy, particularly in like places like Florida, places like Texas, Colorado, Arizona, like all these places, their real estate just skyrocketed. What about the people who've already lived here, whose values of their homes increased, right? If you bought a house for $500,000 and you're now that house is worth a million two, like those people are going around, a lot of them, and they're using that as if that's in their net worth. And that's like something that Ray Dalio
Yeah.
talks about is like, just because the market says that your house is worth 1.2 million doesn't mean that you're worth 1.2 million. It's a assumed wealth or an assumed asset or assumed value, not an actual value. That you're not worth 1.2 million until the house sells for that, and that's in your bank account or in escrow or whatever.
Yeah.
right? So, but people perceive that, and they get valuations on their property, and they leverage against that, assuming that they have that
Yep.
value, and that leads
Yeah,
to
and when you take on debt too,
mm-hmm,
let's say you still have a mortgage on that house, and then you leverage that, and you don't pay it off, and you think, oh, hey, I can invest in another house, let's say, or I can invest in something else, and while everything's increasing in value, it seems great, but once something slows down and the brakes are pushed, and I think that's what's going to happen with us in
mm-hmm,
America here. I think eventually, at some point, there's going to be some kind of fallout, and people aren't going to buy. The world isn't going to necessarily buy our debt anymore, and we're going to have a big problem. And it
mm-hmm,
was kind of scary, like when they just passed, the debt ceiling again recently. It was like, if they don't pass this debt ceiling, like obligations don't get paid. I mean, people don't get paid. So we're literally, like, the government's not taking in enough money to even just pay everybody. So it's all funny money.
mm-hmm,
Once you go off of the gold standard, and you don't have a hard currency, or you don't have a currency linked to gold, you don't have a currency linked to some precious metal, you're a floating interest, you're a floating currency at that point, and you're just so susceptible to manipulation.
mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I think it's a scary thing.
It is, and I don't understand why more people don't realize it. I don't know if they just want to pretend it's not happening. I don't know if they're not educated or, perceptive to it. I don't know
I think people
if
are
it's.
waking up a little bit now that, like, inflation's so high. They're starting to, like, ask these questions, right?
Mm-hmm,
But I feel that, like, most people, they don't dig. They don't want to dig. They don't want to, like, they don't want to think. They don't want to do the research, right? They don't want to. They just want easy answers, like, oh, we need a new politician, or oh, it's the Republicans' fault, or oh, it's the
yeah.
Democrats' fault. And it's like, look, it's much bigger. Like, it starts with. I mean, Ray Dalio even talks about, like, your own personal finances, your personal income statement, what you bought, how much you make, how much you spend, what assets you own. That's the same thing for a town. It's the same thing for a state, and it's the same thing for a country.
Mm-hmm,
Those fundamental principles follow throughout, and I think it's so important to have those fundamental principles at the individual level and at the macro level. And if the politicians aren't leading by example, if the country is taking on debt, a, a, it doesn't have an income statement where our income is in excess of our expenses and our assets aren't solid assets, what are we doing? How can they then expect the individuals to follow suit, and
mm-hmm,
to not follow suit, I should say? And how are they expecting the individuals to be fiscally responsible when the government's not fiscally responsible? And it's a recipe for disaster. And
yeah.
and that goes on to, like, other interesting topics. I know we're both interested in, like, just like extreme ownership, and other topics such as just or just financial topics. Guys like Dave Ramsey, or what's that guy who wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad? Just trying to
Oh,
think
Robert
about the
Kawasaki,
important.
Kaisa.
Yeah, Kiyosaki, Robert
Yeah,
Kiyosaki, I think.
I always call him
So I don't know.
Kawasaki. I think I just like the motorcycles.
Yeah, it's close enough.
Sorry, Robert.
You might not be too happy about that. But no, those concepts are so important. So I think that's also something that would be really good to cover as well.
Yeah,
In
no,
future episodes.
absolutely. I um
Yeah.
I also think Ray Dalio makes a point of talking about how, like, as people get wealthier, they get more comfortable and they tend to work less less hard, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in the
Yeah.
United States alone. Now, I don't mean in the sense, so you have to look at this as a split view, because you can have somebody who makes $40,000 a year and are effectively, I mean, poor. I don't that sounds bad, but like, you know, in today's economy, that's not a lot of money, and you're making
You're
$40,000, you're
not getting
scraping
very
by.
far.
Yeah. But if you take 40,000 US dollars and you compare yourself to someone living in Mexico or in the Philippines, you're balling out of control, right? So I do think that there's on a on an international level, I think that Americans are inherently lazy. I think people that don't make now I'm not saying that everybody who makes, you know, you know, less money in the United States is like this. I'm also not saying that everybody who makes a ton of money in the United States isn't like this, because I'm sure there's some people that make a shitload of money and are totally lazy. In fact, I know some. So, but I'm just saying, in as a generalization, and generalizations are never good. I know you get a lot of hate for generalizations these days, but generally speaking, I do think that's why you see some of the stuff, the political things that you see, um, is because people want things handed to them and they don't want to work hard, and that's why I mean, dude, just
Yeah.
look at people who come here from other countries. If you see people who come from South America, if you see people who come from Mexico, some of the hardest working fucking people you'll ever meet. They'll outwork anybody in the United States,
No.
and that just goes to show
Yeah.
you, you know, what his principle says, where when you come from a poorer economic country, you're much more likely to work hard, especially when you realize and you have an appreciation for the opportunities, thereby saying, again, generally speaking, in the United States, even the lower class, the United States' lower class, seems to work less hard and want more handouts, just
Yep.
based on the comfort that this country provides them. And that's
Yep.
also something that you have to
Yeah.
be mindful of, because this all leads to a bad place for the entire country, for
Yeah.
everybody,
Yep.
you know.
Yeah. No, and I think that's like why it's so important for our government to have some initiatives that really that focus on boosting the middle class, that focus on boosting good middle income salaries and jobs for the average person. I think that's just like so important, because we really want to limit that wealth gap, and we want to encourage people to go to work, and going to work builds self-esteem. You know, like if you don't work, you don't have that positive feedback, you know, whether it be, you know, at the end of a week or two, you get a paycheck in return, or your boss says good job on a project you do. And there's so many tangible and intangible benefits to working and being a part of society. You feel like you belong to something, right? You feel like you're a part of a corporation, you're a part of a team. That is so important for us. And when people aren't working, when the government's willing to give out money for nothing, it's very dangerous, I feel like. And getting into a little bit of like the PPP loans and COVID and what the US government did is just, I think it's such a disservice to people, because early on, I totally agree. We didn't know what this virus was capable of. We didn't know how many people were going to be killed. We really didn't know how deadly it really was. So things really did shut down. And I think maybe the first round of PPP loans and maybe the first set of checks that were cut out for people might have been okay. But I think that the extended unemployment, how long it transpired for, is just it's not healthy. It's not good, because it doesn't hold people accountable. And I'm not saying to let people suffer or not be there and compassionate for somebody who needs a social safety net. But I think sometimes if you don't need it, you shouldn't have it. And there should be strict enforcement of that, because you're leading a very negative feedback loop. You know, if mom and dad take advantage of the system and are on unemployment for a year or two, what does that teach the child? You know, if they're an able-bodied person that can work, you know,
Mm-hmm.
what does that teach their kid? You know, that teaches, oh, mom and dad can, you know, they don't have to work. You know, the government's giving them a paycheck or what. It's just not. It's not the way we want America to rise, and it's not the way we have risen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's just like another thing to be like so conscientious of, and at the same time too, like, you know, the wealthy people in America need to realize that, and they have a lot of influence. Corporations have a lot of influence over policy, and I think they need to do a better job of making sure that, yeah, it's not just about the shareholder. You have to make sure that you're servicing your community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that you're a good corporate citizen. I think that is important to be, you know, cognizant of, and corporations need to realize, you know, like, the more you centralize, the more you automate, you have to realize, like, you're taking away somebody's job, and how are you going to replace that job? And I think there needs to be some recognition of that, you know, by
Definitely.
corporations too. So I think it's a twofold approach. You know, it's the elites, it's the large corporations, and it's, you know, the government, and it's the individuals at the poorer end of the spectrum that I think, you know, I shouldn't say poorer, but people who are taking on, you know, taking government benefits that don't need government benefits. I think that that's where we're running into problems,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's where we're gonna head into our decline. You know, the combination of those two, and then it builds resentment too. It builds resentment again from the middle class. It's just not a healthy society you want to live in. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you want to live in a society where people are doing well. You know, the average person can get a job. The average person feels good about themselves. The average person isn't a drunk. You know, isn't addicted to, you know, pain pills and whatever. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we don't want that. We don't want the average person on psychiatric medication. You know, like, it's not healthy. It's not healthy. So, but it's a
No.
little bit of a tangent, but I think it kind of ties things in a little bit
No, it does. I think the real world
from a macro
examples of all,
perspective.
yeah, the real world of examples of all this, I think, is what people are going to find most helpful. And obviously, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, anybody can go and read the book. The fact is that,
Yeah.
to boil all this down, Ray Dalio lays out a pretty good, structure for why countries and powers and empires rise and fall, and have done so throughout history, and ultimately they get to a point where you have a
Yep.
poor political leadership, which we're experiencing now, and we've talked about that. Then, with poor political leadership, poor decisions are made, both economically and internally within the country. So the economic implications of this are the inflation that we're seeing that's going out of control. That inflation relates to our productivity as a country. It relates to the debt that we're taking on, our
Yep.
inability to service that debt, and also the imbalance between the amount of money the country earns through taxpayers and productivity and things like that, um, and how much we're spending every year. And all of those things, when they're combined, lead to political hostility within the country. And you see that now. Republicans and Democrats, I mean, why there's even two parties, I don't know. I think it's pretty stupid. But they seem to have been able to get along harmoniously. I say that very loosely, for the last couple of years, but since COVID, maybe even before COVID, I guess, since, probably Trump really started it, but at least in my lifetime, if they were going on, I didn't pay attention before then, but for the last couple of years, for sure, the political divide between those two parties has gotten out of control, and so we see all of these things,
Yeah.
um, kind of happening. And again, why do these things matter? Because ultimately, as Ray Dalio puts it, they all contribute to a country's decline. So with that, I mean,
Yep.
what's next? If we do
Yeah. I
default,
think that.
what takes over? Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it India? Is it Mexico? And what can you do about it? That's kind of the next thing. You want to play that video that we?
Well, that those might. Yeah, you can play the video, and that might be a good way to kind of end it there, and we can go on to the next. You know, shoot another podcast where we start talking about the part 2 and part 3, because I think that kind of gets into China and, you know, the U.S. currently, and maybe a little bit more too about some of the more nitty gritty about the last 500 years,
Mhm.
that he explains.
So let's play this
So
real
yeah.
quick.
As a generalization, um, if I was to make a big sweeping generalization, I would say one wants to invest in countries that have good finances, good income statement, balance sheet, earning more than they spend, and have good, because they can withstand disruptions better financially, and they'll be more productive. That don't have big internal conflicts and are not in the risk of being in a war situation. So you see generally money going to those types of places.
So interestingly enough with
Yeah.
that, and we can again talk about this more in the next episode or later on, but China has, in my opinion, one of three of those things. They have good finances and a good balance sheet. They do not have a good internal culture, and they seem to constantly be at the brink of war, at least with us in the U.S. I don't know what that means. I do know Ray Dalio in the two main examples that he covered, which was the British Empire and the Dutch Empire. Both of those countries' ultimate demise happened because of war. They over-leveraged themselves. I think the Dutch were fighting the British, and they over-leveraged themselves, couldn't pay their debts.
There were some wars, yep.
Yeah, caused a run on the banks, and then ultimately their debt had to be restructured because of its inability to pay. That allowed the British to rise to prosperity and become the world reserve currency. And the British, same thing happened. It got involved in World War I, I believe, couldn't pay its debts, over leveraged itself to pay for the war, and the U.S. took over in 1945. So, I don't know if China's, in my opinion, I don't know if it's, the thing is too, these are all done through treaties, right? So I don't know if people trust China and the Communist Party enough to have them be the world power. But I do know that, I don't know. I do know that they have one of three of those things. I know they're doing well. And the U.S. economically is not doing well. And who knows if the U.S. ultimately, if conflict doesn't, I mean, this whole thing with Ukraine is scary. If there is not a resolution and World War III breaks out, we could very well see this cycle happen where the U.S. over leverages itself to get involved in World War III and China takes over. That could be the demise. But who knows? There's a lot of interesting things about China and Xi and the Communist Party that was talked about in Peter Zeihan's book, The End of the World as We Know It. I'd love to cover that on the podcast sometime too. I think that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm definitely down to read that.
But yeah, so there you go.
I think that's probably like a great way to probably end this, and then we can get into how Ray Dalio has viewed China, how he's learned about China through his investing experience, what he's learned from because he's really seen China open up to the world, the global economy, and was very involved in different aspects of developing like the Chinese market. So I think that will be like a really good way to like start talking about that, start talking about the Chinese perspective, and then kind of how America fits into that. So I think that might be a great way to cover that in the next like podcast.
Cool. Sounds good. We'll end it here. See everybody next week.